Hello and good evening. My name is Lisa Norberg, and I am the director of the library here at the Cooper Union. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this historic Great Hall. The Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art is among the nation's leading colleges for students pursuing degrees in architecture, art, and engineering. And since its founding, this institution has also stood as a public forum for New Yorkers to amplify calls for social justice, debate timely issues, and participate in the shaping of American life. We continue that tradition tonight with what I know will be a fascinating discussion on an incredibly important topic: drug criminalization and its impacts on addiction, music, and the arts. I want to begin by thanking the New York Philharmonic for partnering with us on tonight's program. Cooper has a long-standing relationship with the NY Phil, dating all the way back to 1914, when Maestro Joseph Stronsky led the ensemble through works of Beethoven, Wagner, and Liszt, right on this stage. More recently, we were honored to welcome the New York Phil Teaching Artist Ensemble to help us celebrate the launch of an incredible new digital archive called Voices of the Great Hall. This free online collection gathers all known recordings produced on this stage, dating back to 1941. Along with thousands of Great Hall photographs and ephemera, they tell the story of American civil rights, social activism, electoral politics, education, the arts, and culture. Voices from the Great Hall is made possible by the generous support of the Robert David Lyon Gardiner Foundation, and we are so deeply grateful to the Foundation for presenting tonight's program as part of the Gardiner Foundation Great Hall Forum. This series seeks to connect timely and critical conversations with those that have happened in the Great Hall over the course of its history. Tonight's panel is also presented as part of the New York Phil's The Unanswered Questions, a series that builds on the orchestra's programming to serve as a lens through which to examine the complex issues of our day. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening's program, who will in turn introduce our panelists. Leah Goodridge is a litigator and educator with over a decade of experience in community empowerment, housing rights, and racial justice. Currently, Goodridge serves as the managing attorney for housing policy at Mobilization for Justice, where she leads housing policy efforts and eviction defense litigation. She has won several cases which have been published and previously argued before the New York State Court of Appeals. In 2018, Mayor Bill de Blasio appointed Goodridge to serve as the tenant representative on the New York City Rent Guidelines Board, where she worked to achieve affordable rent for tenants citywide. She is an inspiring and unwavering voice on the issues of housing justice and has won many accolades for her advocacy. We are so grateful to have her with us as part of this conversation. Please join me in welcoming Leah Goodridge.
Welcome. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. We are so excited to have you here. We are going to have a very exciting and intimate conversation tonight. We're going to be like a small family. So let me introduce you to the family. Baba Israel is a hip-hop artist, hip-hop theater artist, poet, educator, and consultant raised in New York by parents who were core members of the Living Theater. Baba is part of Bronx Banda with Arturo O'Farrell and has shared the stage with artists such as KRS-One, Lester Bowie, Outkast, Bahamadia, and Medusa. He is a teaching artist in the areas of hip-hop, music production, spoken word, and theater. He works with City Lore in organizations such as BAM, Piano Slam, and Arts Horizons. He holds an MFA in Interdisciplinary Arts from Goddard College and is the artistic director of the performance project based at the University Settlement. His newest production, Cannabis, a Viper Vaudeville, premiered in 2022, produced by Here at the Ellen Stewart Theater at La Mama. Okay, we can do an applause. Fay Victor owns a unique vision for the vocalist's role in jazz and improvised music regarding repertoire, improvisation, and composition. Her everything is everything aesthetic permeates her work in performance, where a standard can lead to a free improvisation or an outburst, and back again. In over a 20-year span, Victor has released 9 albums as a leader to critical acclaim, as well as worked with luminaries like Dave Burrell, Archie Shepp, Mark Ribbett, and more. Currently, Victor is leading 2 groups, Sound Noise Funk, with 2 releases out in the world, 2018's Wet Robots and 2020's We've Had Enough. Sound Funk is an improvising unit that also uses Victor's Launchpad compositions for further improvisational exploration. Victor is on the faculty of the New School of Jazz and Contemporary Music and Rock Nation at Long Island University, a member of the International Contemporary Ensemble, and chairs the advisory board for the Jazz Leaders Fellowship through the Brooklyn Conservatory, a fellowship designed to offer funding and support to Black, female, and non-binary jazz musicians. Round of applause. Woo! And finally, in a career that has spanned more than 2 decades, Mark Travis has just about done it all, serving as a writer, a producer, broadcaster, lecturer, podcaster, voiceover artist, multicam director, video editor, and audio engineer. Whew. Currently, director of media production for the New York Philharmonic, he has directed the orchestra's broadcast, hosted by Alec Baldwin, since 2003. From 1999 to 2011, Mark served as a producer for Chicago's WFMT radio network, where he wrote and directed more than 800 nationally syndicated programs. He also has an extensive discography as a music producer, including 3 Grammy-nominated recordings in 5 categories by the New York Philharmonic, a recipient of more than 40 medals and honors for his broadcast work. Mark has earned the 2015 Grand Jury Prize and 5 Best Director awards from the New York festivals, and he was named a special honoree for his writing in the 2017 Webby Awards. Whew, round of applause. So I want to say we are so excited. We're going to jump right into it and have this wonderful conversation about addictive connections. So first off, drug. What's the first word that comes to your mind when you hear that word?
Expansion.
Expansion, okay.
Taboo. Taboo.
Taboo.
The pharmacy.
The pharmacy, okay. So in a study, the American Addiction Center found that creative industries accounted for the 3rd highest for drug use. Why do you think musical artists use drugs and/or alcohol at such a prevalent and high rate?
I mean, there's a few ways to answer this. I think one thing that comes to my mind, first of all, is this term drug. I want to interrogate it for 1 second, because I don't know if all of the substances we may discuss tonight fully fit into that category. I remember being out west and listening to a cannabis researcher and talked about how drugs are a single chemical compound, whereas cannabis, which is an herb, is a complex matrix of chemical compounds that have an entourage effect. Just want to make that distinction for a second. But I'd say also we live in America where artists have been mistreated for generations. And so I think we live in an environment that is not supportive of artists. And so I think artists do use substances to manage the stress and anxiety of navigating an unjust world, an unjust world. And also for expansion and creativity. And I think as we talk, there's a lot of different types of substances that have different impacts. And I'm curious to go deeper into that as we explore.
I just want to sort of add to that I think, as far as from my understanding, drugs have been used in sort of every society on the planet since humans, we know humans to be
True.
to be here, right? So that's why I use the term expansiveness, because I feel before there was sort of any kind of narrative around why one uses drugs, people just use them for whatever reason. And I think where musicians are concerned, just to get back to that, I do think for a lot of musicians, it's a way of checking out of reality. I think maybe that's the way a lot of it starts, and sometimes you can't control it, right? But this sense of like trying to explore other aspects of your mental space so that you can create. So I think that's a big impetus. And depending on where you are in the world, that's encouraged or not, not seen as something negative. But like Baba said, in this country, it has a different connotation.
Yeah, and I would say the idea, certainly, of making the pain go away, in addition to that expansiveness. We don't really have hard evidence of some of the earliest figures in music that we are pretty sure, engaged in the use of recreational drugs. Hildegard Bingen, a medieval composer. I mean, this goes on all the way back. We don't know what she did, but we're pretty sure she did it. And then this continues, through the classical era, and then, of course, famously, as we get into the birth of the blues and jazz in this country. And, it's interesting to see how it sort of goes from being a very antiseptic thing. It's just something that's done. It's, you could get opium at the pharmacy. It was prescribed and, often in laudanum as a tincture. But we start to see, as time progresses, then people realize, maybe there's a creative element to this as well. And I think somewhere early 20th century, the two start to maybe combine, and it's sometimes hard to say which is which. What percent is making the pain go away, what percent is trying to free the mind and explore creativity.
Thank you. It's interesting. Before this panel, we thought, should I use the word drug? And specifically because it's so taboo. Should we use a softer word? Should we use another word? And with that, I just want to quickly say, we'll get back to that in a bit, but we'd like to do a quick Leary sound clip, and then we'll get back to the conversation in a bit.
LSD is the most powerful aphrodisiac ever known to man. Now, it's interesting, some clapped and some didn't. Let me explain what an aphrodisiac is. Aphrodisiac comes from the Greek word for the goddess of love. An aphrodisiac is an agent which promotes love. And by aphrodisiac, I don't mean faster and more motions of robot bodies in bedrooms. I'm, of course, talking about the communication which can exist between people whose neurological cameras are accelerated and much wider and more open.
We were so excited to have this conversation tonight. We just jumped right into it without.
It's okay. We did a flashback.
Yeah.
We just did a flashback. Right?
We had to pump the brakes there for a bit, and now we're back. All right. So I wanna follow up on something you said. So you mentioned, how we're categorizing. So I started by saying that just the term drug is so taboo. Should we find another word? And even just the way that we're categorizing drug, because it has such a negative connotation, but that's why we're talking about it tonight, because it doesn't have a negative connotation in all circles, right? So I want to ask, regardless of the type of drug, do you think that the genre of music plays a role in the perception of a musical artist's use of drugs? Like, for example, a jazz musician, a rock musician, and a hip-hop musician all smoke marijuana. Is it all one and the same, or is the drug use classified differently but depending on the genre of music? Like, let's say a hip-hop artist smoking marijuana is considered a negative connotation, but if a jazz musician does it, it's enlightening, expansive.
Actually, I have a few things I would just like to say about this. I think that's true. I also want to say something about the rock connotation, because I was thinking about when you asked that question, and I think that I would argue that in that scene, they use harder drugs, like cocaine or maybe harder drugs, but I feel like we never hear about it unless someone has to go into rehab or something. I think that's when we actually hear, if it's let's say a white musician or from that world. I mean, I'm not in that world, but that's my perception of it. And I feel with hip hop, which to me is much more benign, I feel like, that does have a negative perception. And I think within jazz, too, I would argue that even though it is in some circles considered okay and cool, but I think because of the communities that are represented, it tends to have more of a negative connotation than, say, the rock world does.
Is it because, I'm wondering, is it that, for example, if a hip hop artist is singing about it and it's included in the music, that it's known? But now I'm wondering, rock artists also include a lot of references to drug use in the music. So you have I mean, if you'd like to expand it, you have a really great point.
Yeah, but I just don't feel it gets a negative connotation when rock musicians do. You know what I mean? Like, when you talk about rappers, I think of Snoop Dogg. It's the first person that comes to mind who's totally proud of it. And I think that's great. He's owning what he's into. But I don't know how many people perceive that as a positive thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's shifting in some ways. You alluded to there's a racial connotation to it, in terms of, I think it's genre, but I think it also relates to race and perception. I think it also has to do with, time and place. Obviously, certain substances are changing. Cannabis is legal in, a significant amount of the country now, even more for medical, so in some ways, that's started to become accepted within certain contexts. But obviously, if you travel to certain states, it's still a taboo. I mean, I have a show about the history of cannabis, and I'll give you an example. I just talked to my booking agent today, and she said, they were at APAP last week, and there was a presenter who said, this looks great. If cannabis was legal in our state, we could bring the show. The show's not illegal. You know what I'm saying? We don't need to use cannabis in the performance of the piece. But there still is, within certain parts of the country, this profound stigma. So it's shifting and changing. I mean, and it's strange because at one moment, Snoop Dogg has this, kind of gangster element, and then he's doing stuff for Martha Stewart. So it's an odd paradigm that we're living in at the moment. And it's also there's these multi-layers. Cannabis is illegal on a federal level, but is now legal on a state level. So it's, we're still working through this. Psychedelics, there's a big shift in conversation around psychedelics. And I mean, you talk about ancient times, I mean, there's research that, psychedelics such as psilocybin may have played a role in our human evolution, and the creation of our ability to access language may be tied back to the early use of psychedelics. So, certain substances have shown, quantifiable healing properties, medicinal properties, and, we gotta open up the dialogue.
Well, and I think you also look at the historical narrative. I think about prominent classical composers, from the Romantic period. We're talking early 1800s, late 1800s. Hector Berlioz famously took opium. Robert Schumann, Frédéric Chopin, also known to be opium users. But with those three men, I can tell you in music school, their drug use was not a part of what we spoke about. We talked about them as great performers. We talked about, Berlioz and his great book on orchestration. But we never, the other things were things you found out as you dug in a little bit. And wasn't really a part of that person's identity in the same way that, we say a name like Snoop Dogg or Miles Davis, and all of a sudden we're thinking,
Or Billie Holiday.
Or
That's
Billie
right.
Holiday, absolutely.
No, and if you go back into the DNA of drug policy in this country, and particularly in the last 100 years or more, jazz musicians were targeted explicitly by the government. The anti-cannabis rhetoric of that time, the anti-marijuana rhetoric was, manufactured and went against, during Nixon's time, there were studies and the studies were thrown out because they did not support the propaganda. So, it's been this documentation of, whether it's Harry J. Anslinger, in the 30s, or Nixon, later on, or Hoover. We are targeting jazz musicians. We are targeting the black community. We are targeting hippies. We are targeting Jews. Like these things are documented.
And a class issue too, if I can just add, in that, the composers I mentioned, these are all white males from Europe that, are participating in something that was medically available. There wasn't really a stigma, but we certainly see a stigma against the use of alcohol with composers like Mozart or Beethoven. It was spoke, in derogatory circles. Their reputation was lessened. Would have been
One of, what I think a lot of us would say is one of the greatest singers of our time. Well known that she battled drug use. And I think what we've been talking about is there are a lot of artists who use drugs, and many of which are seen as it enhances their musical talent. And in Whitney Houston's case, I think it was a little bit different in the sense that it was often seen as it's hindering her talent. It's, this term was often used as she's wasting her talent. Do you think that that was because of the genre that she was in, which was more so pop, sometimes R&B, as opposed to, like, for example, do you think that that might have been different if she was a rock artist, and maybe it would have been perceived as this is enhancing her talent and her music? Or do you think that it was just because that perception was because she was black, or is it a mix of all, or is it none?
I think it has to do with the show, the Bobby Brown show, actually. I think a lot, at least for
You
my...
all remember that show.
We all remember that show, Being Bobby Brown.
What a wild show.
Being Bobby Brown. And I remember, because until that show, I was not even aware that she had an issue with drugs. It was like people were talking about it, whispering about it, but it wasn't it didn't feel like, I might be remembering this differently, it didn't feel like it was really out in this And that show for me, it just really sort of like amplified that. And people were not sympathetic towards her at all. That was, for me, that was very sad. I feel like but I do think that the idea, I have to say, the narrative that it didn't help her artistry, I actually don't have a problem with that. Because I feel like that may be, in a twisted way, is about a kind of looking, in a certain way, looking out for her. It's like saying, okay, this is not helping you. And that might have been said to somebody that was white. That might have been said to an artist that was white. Did the exact same thing. You know what I mean?
I wonder if, like, let's say if it had been, say, Lenny Kravitz,
Right.
who's more so a rock artist,
Right.
if it would have been the same, right? And he's also black.
Yeah.
And would it have been just, this is part of the identity, this is part of the music, and maybe this is also enhancing, and this is what's appealing, as opposed to no empathy. Go ahead.
I would think in both cases, I would think if Lenny kept it together, in other words, if he was using and he kept it together, and then I think, I agree. But I think what that show amplified in the case of Whitney was like she was not keeping it together. And I think that's, the agency to kind of just start to say all these things. I think had she been keeping it together, because she was so famous, I mean, it was like, maybe.
She's America's sweetheart.
Yeah.
That's why I say I don't know if is it the genre or?
Yeah, so I'm saying I wonder, it's a really interesting question about Whitney. I think she's a slight outlier.
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely take your point that I think she had more of a mainstream identity that, that sort of wouldn't support her, artistic identity. But I think for me, the larger issue is we still live in a country where drugs are criminalized. And as long as they're criminalized, it impacts the ability to seek help. It impacts the ability for people to be public or to, even within their own families. So I think, as long as drugs remain a criminalized element in our country, people are going to lose their lives. People are going to be harmed either by the criminal justice system or by the substances themselves. Because I think we have to say there are some substances which will not kill you. No one has ever been killed by cannabis. It just has not happened. There are some substances you can overdose from that can be very harmful to your body and to your well-being. But as long as we live in this culture where there's this criminalization, people will not be able to seek the right kind of help because there is shame, there are criminal prosecution issues to deal with. So I think for me, there really needs to be a fundamental shift of how we look at this issue in our country at a policy level, not just at a social or cultural level.
Right, that visceral visual, the crooner Bobby Darin, is attributed as saying people hear what they see. And I think Whitney is a classic example of that. Had she not, had her outward appearance deteriorate, I don't think anybody would have thought anything of it. It would be like, oh, okay, to Fay's point, had she kept it together, it would have been a little asterisk perhaps, but I think it's that way in which, especially with people who are in the public like that, we don't get into that kind of depth. It's an instant type of thing, and it's like, oh, this person's together. It doesn't really matter what's going on behind.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really big thing in this society. If everything looks like it's okay, we're not going to dig any deeper. Yeah. I would like to just touch on something that Baba said. I think I think you really sort of touched on something that's important. We need that the way we look at drugs in this country and the way it's criminalized does have a huge impact on how people seek out help if they need it. And I just want to sort of touch. I lived in the Netherlands for a long period of time, and what was really amazing about that society is the first evidence was how openly people spoke about anything. I moved there in the 90s, and people openly spoke about having AIDS. People openly spoke about having issues with substance abuse or mental issues, and that was amazing to me. You might just meet somebody and just have this conversation. But in that society, if you have a substance abuse issue, it's considered a disease. It's not criminalized. It's not considered. You're not going to be punished within the criminal justice system because you are a user, and that was mind-blowing to me. And you can see it reflected in the whole society, how people talk about things, how people will readily say, I have an issue, I'm going to go get help, and with no shame. For example.
Similar in Portugal, where I believe they've decriminalized all drugs, and therefore can have safe practices, have much more outreach into the community in terms of education, access. So yeah, whether you're music or whoever you are in society, we got to shift the dialogue, I think.
And just to provide some context, I think, in the U.S., we had and still do have had years of very disproportionate drug laws where it really has a huge racial impact. At one point, 50% of the U.S. Prison population were of black men. There was a report done years ago about it. And these were for many of the drug offenses many of the offenses were nonviolent, and many of them were for marijuana. And now we're moving towards legalization. I want to ask, what is your concept? What is your idea of how we should look? We've been talking a bit about a society that shouldn't exist, that we shouldn't strive towards, which is our current society about criminalizing drugs. And so what would it look like? Would it look like all drugs are legalized? Would it look like some? Would it look like we have treatment? What exactly would be the goal?
I mean, I'll jump in for a moment and fellow panelists jump in, but I think that all drugs should be decriminalized, and I think there should be a variety of different programs based on what the substance is. I mean, I think New York is, we're in a really interesting moment right now where the second cannabis dispensary for adult use just opened yesterday. And our first two dispensaries, I think, are a good example, and I think New York has made a specific effort, and I think we can be proud of that as New Yorkers, to try to address the inequity of the war on drugs. I mean, in a local context, 90% of the cannabis arrests, pretty much going back decades, have been black and brown folks. Like, that's the data. So now, how do we address that? So the first two dispensaries to open, one is Housing Works, just up the block. And to me, that's a great model where you have a nonprofit who does very important advocacy around homeless folks or unhoused folks. And then the second dispensary is a black-owned dispensary, because the 50% of the first licenses in New York were set aside for social equity applicants. And these are folks who are coming from zip codes that were disproportionately criminalized. So I think, that's one model of how we can start to address the real terror of the war on drugs and the communities that it's harmed, is that as things are legalized, we have to have policy to make sure then it's not just, existing corporations or, white male-led companies that are reaping all the benefits.
I want to quickly push back on that. So we've been talking about cannabis, but if you're listening to this conversation and you have a relative who has been battling addiction with, say, heroin, and you hear that we want to legalize it, I don't know, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, in Portugal, they've decriminalized it. And what that allows for is clean needle programs, access to morphine, access to treatment plans, and the lack of fear that you're going to be arrested if you go seek help. So that's what I would say. I'm not saying, I think certain substances need to be treated with caution, and they need to be treated carefully, whether they're legal or pharmaceutical, because we know there's an opioid crisis in this country as well, which is a legal drug crisis.
Great. Thank you. Anyone else want to quickly make a quick comment? All right, so we are going to have a quick performance by Fay Victor, and it'll be a Purple Magic performance, so and then we'll be right back to the conversation.
Don't need no reefer, don't need cocaine. Purple music does the same to my brain, and I'm high, so high. Don't need no cymbals, no saxophone. Just need to find me a style of my own and get high, so high. Some people can't understand just being inside a church don't make a righteous man, and you're high. It's alright. In time we all die, home music gone, So we better do our best to get along and get high. So high. Got no theory, ain't got no rules. Let's let the purple music tell my body what to do. It's alright. It's alright. Every subject, any key. Purple music doesn't happen, happens naturally. It's alright. It's all right, 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 right. Ooh, 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 yeah, oh. So, yeah, oh, oh, we'll make a wish and visit purple paradise. We'll get high. So high. Tried to make me go to rehab, but I said no, no, no. Yes, I've been black, but when I come back, you know, no, no. I ain't got the time, and if my daddy thinks I'm fine, trying to make me go to rehab, but I won't go, go, go. I'd rather be at home with Ray. I ain't got 70 days, 'cause there's nothing you can teach me that I can't learn from Mr. Hathaway. I didn't learn a lot in class, oh, but I know it don't come in a shot glass. They're trying to make me go to rehab, but I won't go, go, go. Yes, I've been black, but when I come back, you'll know I ain't got the time. Oh, if my daddy thinks I'm fine, they're trying to make me go to rehab, but I won't go, go, go. They're trying to make me go to rehab, but I won't go, go, go. Bop, bop, bop. Stop, stop, stop.
That was amazing, wasn't it? Another round of applause. That was amazing. Thank you. All right, so I want to touch on something that was mentioned earlier. We're gonna go a few decades back, the cabaret card. So for anyone who knows, the cabaret card was a permit required of all performers in New York City. And in 1947, Billie Holiday famously had her card suspended for a drug-related arrest. Many believe she was targeted after singing the anti-lynching song Strange Fruit. And because of the cabaret suspension, she was kept from performing in nightclubs for 10 years. Can you talk about the cabaret card and how it worked to criminalize drug use and hinder Black artists?
Wow. Well, as a jazz musician myself, it's sort of a big part of the history of this music, especially in the 40s and 50s when a lot of jazz musicians were hooked on heroin. There were a considerable amount of jazz musicians hooked on heroin, people from Miles Davis, who beat it and came back again, but a lot of musicians. Musicians maybe we don't even know. The issue with the cabaret card was that it was distributed by the police. You had to go to a police station to get it. And not only did you have to go, they took your fingerprints. So they had all of your information just so you can get this card so you can work. And they policed venues, and if you had a drug offense, if you were arrested, you would lose your cabaret card and you just could not work within New York City. And what's really discriminatory about this card is it was designed basically to keep clubs, so the clubs had a certain level of a certain standard of behavior and of the sort of the patrons and the musicians that played within it. So yeah, very discriminatory card and practice. I also want to talk about Charlie Parker in this. Charlie Parker also lost his cabaret card for many years, forcing him to leave New York City.
Who was Charlie Parker?
Charlie Parker was one of the originators of bebop, an alto saxophone player and incredible alto saxophone player. He literally changed the sound of jazz and a composer. And not only was he important as a musician, he was important to a burgeoning musical universe. And a club was named, Birdland is named after Charlie Bird Parker. Well, he was forced out of New York because to work, and so he went on the road and he went across the country, and at a certain point he ended up in an insane asylum. And the question kind of comes up, well, if somebody who's, let's say, has a substance issue, which he did, wouldn't it have been better if he could stay closer to home, right? Closer to home and be around people, his wife, be around his kids, be around his family and maybe get better. But the cabaret card, the cabaret laws really prevented this for a lot of artists.
So the criminal, so we were talking a bit about what is the goal earlier. So is the goal just to legalize everything, and how might that make things better or even worse? So if you're an artist and you are struggling with use of drugs, and you go for help, there's a good chance you would get arrested.
Potentially, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so the criminalization part, the criminalization of the drugs itself is a huge part of what stops people from going for help, and therefore making it a crisis, making it worse.
Right. Sometimes I wonder if that's also if that's partly by design as well.
Yeah, I mean, you think there's a famous image of Harry J. Anslinger once again visiting Billie Holiday in the hospital and really harassing her while she's hospitalized, and images being released to stigmatize, to shame, I think about, it's interesting, I think about Louis Armstrong, and he's one of our great, American artists and American heroes, and I've done a lot of work with the State Department as a cultural ambassador. And he was one of the first musicians, I believe, to do that work, to go out and represent Black music, jazz music, which is really American classical music, to the world. And it's interesting because Louis always maintained, to some degree, a sense of acceptance within the mainstream perception in a way that maybe someone like Charlie Parker didn't, but was a lifelong cannabis user, And if I could, maybe I might share with you. In the show that I wrote about cannabis, we did a section to celebrate Louis and to sort of honor the role that cannabis played in his life. So would it be okay if I shared a little moment of that?
Sure.
Yeah, would you play my video for a moment?
On the move, dreams in our eyes. We're on the move, dreaming. We're on the move. This wide King Road show. Hot times high. We're on the move, northward bound. We're on the move, freedom bound. We're on the move, man, get in the groove.
Now pops in Chi-Town, he's searching for a spark. Some bands blow him off cause they say he's too dark. But he finds a home with the Vipers, the marijuana lifers. I'm gigging the Windy City. The trumpet maestro tries his first blow a gauge in the back room of the Savoy Ballroom. He digs the sweet smell and the taste. He had himself a ball with a smile on his face. Now sarsaparilla lover, marijuana, Mary Jane, marijuana, something like a slow dance. Reaper on a daily, no effect on his dexterity. His work ethic not in jeopardy. Racism on the road, cannabis a remedy. Now Pops was on for muggles, the herb joking, jiving, proselytizing, vibing with wonderful cats, congregating to light up some of that good shit. Stone solidarity, healing balm of community, smoking grass that made Satch feel like one of the gang. Appreciate pot the warmth and bronze to the hang. Another tea smoker, it's the kismet of kinship. Pass the bluesy solo like a marijuana cigarette. Pass the bluesy solo like a marijuana cigarette. Pass the bluesy solo like a marijuana cigarette. Pass the bluesy solo like a marijuana cigarette.
There you go.
Wonderful.
I kind of wanted to share that just to remind us that there is these struggles and these challenges and these life-threatening things, but with some substances, in my opinion, the life-threatening comes from the criminalization. I mean, you know, cannabis can bring a lot of joy to a party, to a music, to a jam session, to a band, and as Louis Armstrong said, and it's a quote that I put in my lyrics there, you know, cannabis was a remedy for racism. You know, it was one of the ways that Louis Armstrong managed the insane abusive pressure of being a black man on the road, having, you know, whether it's about bathroom access, getting into venues, just the dehumanizing treatment. Cannabis was a way to manage that. And, you know, when he first went to Chicago, he found this community of vipers, of these cannabis enthusiasts who took him in, you know, and so it can also be a way of building community.
I want to follow up on that and ask the whole panel. You know, so the title is Addictive Connections, and obviously not all drug use is addiction. And we've been talking about those distinctions. There's some just for enhancement, some just recreational, just because, but not an addiction. And I want to get into those distinctions. And you touched on, and I want to open it up and ask you both. You know, was there more in your perception as an artist? Is there more of a likelihood for drug use as a coping mechanism, as self-medication, because of marginalization, because a person is from a marginalized background, whether they're Black, they're LGBTQIA, and they're in the music industry and navigating it, as opposed to a person from a more privileged background, and for them it is enhancement, it is recreation. Is there such a thing, or it's just sort of all one and the same?
Actually, I think it's pretty personal. You know,
Right.
I have to say, I think it's pretty personal because I think a person of privilege can just have some issues and that they feel that they need to medicate. Yeah, can self-medicate too, and somebody from another maybe marginalized just wants to enjoy and can actually see. Maybe because of the situation, they can actually see how expansive it can be, you know, or maybe using it as an escape in a positive way, like to kind of just, you know, kind of what Bob was, you know, referencing Louis Armstrong, kind of just as a coping mechanism, but maybe even more positive way, just as being able to just have some space, you know, some people maybe. So I really think it's a personal thing, and I do think that some people tend to have more addictive personalities than others. Like my husband, for example. My husband's the type of person, like he can smoke like a pack of cigarettes a day for 2 weeks and then just, that's it, and then put it aside and then not do anything for years. So, you know, there are people just that are like that. So I think it also depends on the personality.
Yeah,
I do really think it's an individual thing.
Even going back to music school, it was sort of there were users and not users, and that was sort of the identity. You know, if that wasn't your scene, you knew how to kind of divorce yourself from it, and if it was your scene, you very much knew where to find it. But I don't think it was necessarily, at least at that level, you know, at least at a college level, wasn't necessarily a black and white thing, wasn't necessarily a socioeconomic class. I mean, let's face it, you know, most people pursuing classical music at a certain level, you know, there is a certain number of people that are coming from privilege, you know, not 100%, not me, but there certainly are a lot who do. But yeah, it was just sort of this thing that, I think it was sort of ecumenical in a way.
I grew up on Long Island, and I remember the burnouts of my high school, and they were all white. They were all white.
Right?
That's
Yep.
That's
So
interesting.
it's really interesting. Yeah.
No, when I, as a high schooler who loved heavy metal and had the long hair and stuff, all the time, this, and I was probably 28 years old before I ever inhaled. Sorry, Mom. Yeah.
I want to ask, so we've been talking a lot about the perception of musical artists from really just, outside of the musical world. And so what I'm wondering is, what about inside the creative industry, inside as artists, what is the perception of drug use in the industry? Is it taboo?
I think it depends on what scene you're in. I'm sure all of us are connected to a multitude of scenes, and it would depend on the situation. I do want to touch on one quick thing, though, because, I think about the group Parliament, right? Parliament was a doo-wop group. They did doo-wop music. They wore suits. They had a very specific style. Post-psychedelics, we have Parliament Funkadelic, and we have the Mothership. So I just want to say that there's many black artists who have used substances in a truly expansive, artistic, visionary way, not just as a way of managing stress. I just wanted to really highlight that.
Most of prog rock.
Exactly.
I think of the Moody Blues.
There's a lot of scientists. There's a lot of people in computer science, who've used psychedelic substances to break through new ideas, new innovations in technology. But let's go back to your other question now.
Sure. So I was asking about
the scene. I think
is
within the
it
hip hop.
taboo?
Growing up in hip hop, it was more taboo if you didn't smoke pot within certain scenes, or smoke weed or smoke blunts or whatever it was. But then within certain of the dance community, a lot of my b-boy and b-girl friends, they were so serious about their physicality, they were not as much into that as maybe the MCs. So I think it depends. Reggae music.
Definitely.
There's
music. But I remember, I used to be a member of I used to be a club head. I used to be a member of the Paradise Garage, and people only did drugs. Nobody did alcohol. They didn't even sell alcohol. You couldn't even get alcohol at the club.
That's right. You go to house music clubs.
You go to house music clubs. There is
juice.
no alcohol.
It's all juice.
Right.
And other things.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times, it's this quietly understood thing, going into the classical community and whatever. It's, it's somewhat like band camp, with various, small ensembles and orchestras, and I think it's, you don't think anything of it. It's just something that you're sort of aware. You don't necessarily talk about it. I think with legalization, people are talking about it more often, but let's just say that, I was in Boston for something recently, and, even though nobody discussed it, we all knew, why everyone was leaving the hotel in staggered amounts, because it was to visit a dispensary that was nearby and had better prices.
So it was accepted, but
Yeah.
still taboo in the sense of not to outwardly talk about it.
Yeah, you don't want to be overheard, it's for your close friends.
Yeah, we're still shifting. Making this show about the issue of cannabis was a big step for me because, a lot of my life, it's I grew up in the Living Theater, which was totally countercultural. Cannabis, LSD, psychedelics, that was something I grew up around. There was a clear distinction. I remember Julian Beck, the founder of the Living Theater, he was like, watch out for the hard drugs, stay close to cannabis and psychedelics. That was sort of the culture that I grew up in. But being an educator, working in schools, working in community work, I just really didn't talk about my relationship to substances or cannabis because there was such a powerful taboo. To be honest, what shifted for me is I became a caregiver for my mother. And my mother has dementia, and I used cannabis to treat her. She became a medical patient in New York, and it was breathtaking, the effect that it had on her and how it supported my care of her. And when I did that, I said, I have to come out and talk about this because this is the most challenging thing I've ever done in my life, is caring for my mother with dementia. And her use of cannabis has made it somewhat manageable. And so it gave me a sense that I have a way to talk about this now that people will see with a more serious eye than just someone getting high for fun, you know.
So we were talking a bit about, the different decades. I think we touched on, obviously, the cabaret. There was a hippie movement of the 60s and 70s. And then the 1980s brought along Reagan's war on drugs. And drug use itself was demonized. Commercials aired, warning children of the dangers of drug use well into the 90s. I remember those. Who remembers those commercials?
The Dare.
This is
program.
your brain on drugs. That is seared into my memory. So I'm wondering, can anyone speak? They were laughable.
They were totally laughable.
They were laughable.
And also terrifying.
I have to say, look, I grew up in Brownsville, and they were very laughable. They weren't stopping anyone. So can anyone speak to how this larger culture shift and change was felt in the creative industries, or was it? There's this larger shift in the nation that's really ramping up the war, making it even a war on drugs, and changing it and demonizing it, and criminalizing it. And so as that was happening, was there also a culture shift in the creative industries, or did it just remain the same?
Well, for myself, I wasn't yet a creative artist, so I was, I was still in school, and I was still actually going to have a very different career trajectory. But what I remember, this was the 80s, I remember a lot of people using cocaine. Like, I remember that was just, so there was this war on drugs, but it felt like this very abstract thing. Because on the ground were the people that I knew, everybody, it seems like everybody was using at that time. I actually never used cocaine, just was never interested. But just, it was just, so, it felt like, that's why I was those commercials were kind of laughable. Because it just felt like a major disconnect from what was actually, how people were functioning and thinking about drugs.
Yeah, and I think too, it made it just more tantalizing, that it created this extra mystery, like, oh, well, why is Nancy Reagan telling me to say no to drugs? And, oh, why is, Mark Travis, part of the DARE program, DARE to keep kids off drugs, and talking at my school about how to avoid this. And it was that, Mark Travis was on his own little campaign to say, hey, just because I have long hair and like heavy metals doesn't mean I smoke grass, But and it had nothing to do with the message. I didn't care if people did drugs or not. I thought that was their own decision. But then, you get to a college environment and all of a sudden it becomes yippee, and I think, it just sort of reinforces. We can talk about drinking laws in Europe in a similar fashion, That's its own panel, probably.
Yeah, but I think, the challenge is at one level, I remember my dad had this VHS tape where someone had taken, all those Nancy Reagan speeches and ads and remixed them. So it was encouraging people to do drugs. It was an amazing video. It got some good laughs from that one.
We would love to see that.
Oh, I think I have it. I think I got it somewhere in the archive.
We need that clip.
I think I got it for the archive somewhere. But there was also very real and very dangerous results of that policy. There was mass arrests, there was, mass incarceration, there were, families broken apart, fathers taken away from children, property seized, and then also there was just such mis and disinformation. In our show we bring up footage of Reagan actually, where he says, marijuana, the most dangerous drug in America. That's literally what Reagan said. He called it the most dangerous drug in America, which is now you can go buy at Housing Works. So there's a disconnect there. There's a disconnect
Same
there.
drug, hasn't
And then
changed.
also there was a study, the famous study that cannabis kills brain cells, which is also misinformation. Because what they would do is it's so cruel. They would fill these chambers where monkeys were with so much smoke that the monkeys would asphyxiate and die of smoke inhalation. And that's what would kill the brain cells. It was not the cannabis. Cannabis is actually a neuroprotectant.
Wow. I also want to I think, because I guess for the reason why I do think it was laughable, because for me, the whole mass incarceration train didn't really start moving until Clinton. Right? So for me, but Reagan did set the stage. I would even argue Nixon set the stage.
Absolutely.
We go back. but Reagan did set the stage for like sort of the prison complex and the privatization of prisons and just the whole movement of people. Yeah, and the what was it, the 3 strikes you're outlaws and all those kinds of things.
Absolutely.
But I really see Clinton as the one.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Nixon because according to the book, Nixon's Secrets, former President Richard Nixon unknowingly carried marijuana through the airport customs for Louis Armstrong.
That's right.
Anyone want to tell this story?
I mean, in researching the show and reading all kinds of amazing stories about Louis Armstrong, that story didn't make it into the show. Maybe it'll make it into a future version. But there was this great moment where, Louis hands Nixon the briefcase, and Nixon has no idea that there's a whole amount of ganja gauge up in there. And it's a beautiful, transcendent moment in our cultural history.
I mean, it also speaks to the larger issue, right? Like he's, obviously he's a president, but as a white male, he's able to pass through without any problems.
That's
whereas
right.
in Louis Armstrong knew that he didn't have the same privilege.
No, it is a symbol. It is a metaphor, And also, it's so wild. I mean, it's literally you're carrying a bag of dried flour. I mean, that's what cannabis is. It's a flower. It is a flower.
Yeah. Well, and it also speaks to, I think, to being able to even frame or have the conversation about it. We didn't talk about the drug use of the composer Berlioz I referenced earlier, really. It wasn't really a footnote until Leonard Bernstein, a privileged white male, had this opportunity, a longtime music director of the New York Philharmonic, and he was able to sort of frame this discussion. And I think he did it in the way, of Lenny doing what he did best, trying to be relatable in 1969 to kind of talk about the Symphonie Fantastique, of Berlioz as this, kind of first psychedelic journey in music. Do we want to hear just a little clip? Yeah. Why don't we play the Symphonie Fantastique? Just that little clip, please. And Berlioz only got weirder than that as time went on.
That's pretty trippy.
Yeah, and actually what's happening there is essentially, that whole piece is this story of someone with unrequited love, and so the first 3 parts are about, declaring his love, and then that obsession turns, and he ends up executing his, or killing his love, and then he's brought before the executioner, and then what we just heard is him sort of seeing all the demons and all the witches having, a time with his tortured soul. And, Berlioz drew on experiences of being a former medical student and having a medical professional as a father, to kind of conjure these images. He knew his way around the morgue, but he also spoke to Dad very openly. Hey, Dad, this is kind of like an opium trip, and it was something relatable and they could just talk about, and, no taboo there. And, when we present this user in 1969, when it's Leonard Bernstein that presents this on a New York Philharmonic broadcast, that's okay. He's relating to the youth. But, if Snoop Dogg, comes out on, and tries to do something similar, then, isn't the narrative different?
So, interesting you bring this up. So last year, I was part of a panel by New York Philharmonic on Julius Eastman. And that's actually what brought about this panel today. And just to provide a little bit of background on that panel, we talked about the life of Julius Eastman, and we wanted to be, real about his life. And we talked a bit about drug use, but then when we talked about mental health and homelessness, it was very clear that that was a taboo topic, and there were some that just didn't want to, didn't want that attached, to his legacy. Legacy was a word that came up very often. Even though these things were likely true, it was more taboo than the drug use. And so I want to talk, it was the mental health and possible homelessness and dying homeless, it was more taboo than the actual drug use. And I want to talk about, we've been talking a lot about criminalization and drug use, and a lot of that, so I'm a tenants' rights attorney, and a lot of that intersects with then what happens once you are in prison, and then when you come out, how easy is it for you to find housing? Oh, it's not easy, actually. And when you get the housing, you're easily evicted because, of an arrest record or because of any other issue dealing with criminalization. And so a lot of these issues intersect, and what I'm wondering is, well, first let's talk about Eastman. What was Eastman's impact on your life? When you think of Eastman, what do you think of? How did Eastman's work impact your life? And then we'll get to the, the housing and the criminalization part.
Wow. Well, I have a really interesting connection to Eastman because Julius, his brother Jerry, when I started as a jazz vocalist, that's where I started with Jerry. And so I knew about Julius, but well, it was a moment when I didn't know that much about music at all. So Jerry talked about Julius, but he actually had just died. So that's the connection to Julius, and then later on I got to know his music. I think, and as a composer myself, I'm really, he uses this term organic music, which I feel a really strong connection to, which to me feels like a Black musical space, and sort of this agency to kind of, to sort of investigate certain music, investigate minimalism and investigate on his own terms. And also he was a great vocalist as well. We need to mention that. So in that way he's been a big impact in terms of just as a force to sort of really assert one's identity. Talking about being gay and Black and just owning that. And I think that's probably in the end what was triggering, what sort of triggered maybe his downfall, because he didn't feel supported in being Black and openly gay, because he was within a white space. That he ended up homeless.
And the white space was?
The white space is the classical musical.
Classical music.
Yeah. Because he was teaching in Buffalo for a while, and then when he came to New York, that's when he really started struggling.
Yeah, that's where we think it kind of entered in,
Right.
the problematic
Period.
use.
Yeah.
And that's just it. I mean, Eastman, he was a hero that I don't think the country knew it needed or was willing to admit, as an openly gay man in the 1970s, and then as an openly gay Black man in the 1970s, that is in this kind of newfound genre of quote-unquote minimalist, but he was really, so many of the minimalist composers were so much more than that, of course. And then he becomes a footnote kind of because of that tragic ending. Tragic because it ended at the age of 49, and tragic because of the circumstances.
Yeah, and being evicted and losing all his scores and all those, that's just, yeah. It's just a very sad story, but I think what's, I feel it's interesting that you mentioned that homelessness was a much more taboo subject to bring about, but he was homeless, and I just want to share, because he lived in Tompkins Square Park, supposedly. I remember I was actually there was a Tompkins Square riot in 1988.
Oh, yeah.
I just happened to be there. And I'll tell you, I saw riot police as far as the eye could see coming down basically to attack people that were just having like cardboard spaces in the park. With my own two eyes. And I saw how the police like brutalized people. Just because certain people were moving into the community and they didn't want to see it anymore. And that community had been there, I don't have to tell you, been there for years. So yeah, it's so tragic. Sorry, it's tragic that he ended that way and in that space, and then to know that space was basically, basically taken away from that community.
Yeah, I think it's. I appreciate everything you've just shared, and it's, I think there is a brutality when it comes to housing, and you know it as someone who's on the front lines of that fight. Housing should be a human right, and we do not have that structure in this country, and definitely not in this city. And I think that mental health and your housing-related issues are still huge taboos, and I feel like even in my lifetime, I've seen the conversation about mental health really break open, and I feel very encouraged by that I feel like people are more openly discussing mental health issues. People are talking about the fact that they see therapists. That all used to feel very hidden and very stigmatized. And I remember even as a younger person, I had stigma about mental health treatment or working with a therapist, or even pharmaceutical medications, which in some cases can be very helpful for people. So
Was that stigmatized, we're talking about in the creative industry as well?
Definitely.
Okay.
No, absolutely. I think, I know a lot of artists who have struggled with homelessness, and it's really unspoken. It's a secret history that a lot of artists I know, even within my community, it's a secret history that they hold. And only if you're a really close friend do you know that people had that chapter, because there is such shame about that. And it is not an individual challenge, it is a systemic challenge that creates that condition.
Before I move on to the next question, I'm actually going to give an opportunity. Is there anything I haven't asked thus far that you want to talk about?
What's the drug scene like in the legal world?
Yeah.
That's for another panel. That's another panel.
That's another panel. But there certainly are, I don't want to get in trouble.
We'll move swiftly along.
I'm going to keep my law license here. Yes, it exists.
Let's get a little note.
Okay, anything else? All right, quickly. So I was wondering, so it was brought up earlier, we talked a lot about the US and the perception of drugs here, and we touched on it earlier. You mentioned Portugal. Can we talk a little bit more about what it felt like? How did you feel when you were abroad? Was it like you can just openly, well, first of all, what I'm wondering, you had touched, sorry, I'm interrupting myself. I'm so excited about this question. Can you name an example of when you went abroad and saw them doing it better? And what was the result? Was it less, were there statistics to show less drug use? What was the result?
I can speak extensively about the Netherlands because that's a place I lived for a long time.
Netherlands, yeah.
And everyone knows the Netherlands has a pretty open, soft drug policy. But what people need to understand it's not a legal policy. It's not legal.
It's a gray area.
It's a gray area. But the Dutch are very pragmatic in general, and they basically see it as they'll turn a blind eye because these things are taxed and they're still going to make money. It's similar to the way that they treat prostitution. That it's legal, it's taken care of. That's more legal, but still, it's a similar idea. But I think what I loved about living there was it was just very little stigma. And when I became an educator when I lived there, and when I was educating, when I sort of had kids, like teenagers, and drugs came up in conversation, first of all, there's no taboo about that happening. No one says to you, you cannot have, if a conversation around drugs comes up in schools, that can't happen. That's fine. But the interesting thing was that most of the teenagers I spoke to had no interest in trying anything. Or if they did, they were like, oh, I'll try. You know, it was very casual, and that was amazing to me. Because there was just no taboo factor. There's a, you know, so if somebody was interested, they tried it, and usually with parents, Dutch parents, there's a sort of a real transparency around these things. I mean, we're not going to get into sexual activity, but it's in general, much more transparency around these things than I see within this society. And you see that in the kids, how they talk about things and how they investigate things and how they, and so in terms, so there is a far less use. And then people who use tend to because they just want to and they want to enjoy it. And when I lived there, I took everybody to a coffee shop. I didn't care if they smoked or not. When you came to visit me in Amsterdam, you were going to a coffee shop because I just wanted people to see what was.
Explain, what was it, just for folks who don't know, what was a coffee shop?
Excuse me?
For folks who might not know, what was a coffee shop?
So coffee shop is what is kind of the name that's given to the place where you would go buy marijuana and or hash.
Yep.
In the Netherlands.
I remember a great moment where I was in Holland with a friend who's a black man, a hip hop artist, and we first time in a coffee shop, and he's having his first, you know, and he went, "Oh shit, the security guard is here to keep me safe."
Yes.
I'm not getting busted. The security guard is here to look out for me right now. That was an amazing moment. But I'll be honest with you, in a lot of the world, it's not actually that much better. I mean, I think Spain has some decent policies. Portugal probably has the most progressive that I'm aware of. But, you know, England, I think, is further behind than us. Scandinavia is further behind than us on this conversation. And, you know, I've done a lot of touring of Southeast Asia. I mean, in Indonesia, you can get the death penalty. So there are places where
I did not know
Japan.
that.
Japan is pretty intense
I mean,
too.
literally the death penalty for drug use.
Yeah. And in Japan is really serious with drugs.
Wow. Well, so now we are going to have a spoken word performance by Baba, and then we'll be right back.
Rope, dope, vapor, smoke, illegal, legal, product, plant of the people. Male, female, medicine, retail, modern, ancient, recreation, and the patient. Counterculture, corporate culture, land race, hybrid, public, private. Open, secret, THC, CBD. Stoned and a lot of energy. Loved, hated, flower, concentrated, underground, regulated, spiritual, scientific, neural and the mystic, flower, weed, liberation and repression, public enemy and a blessing, cannabis. See, since before the written word, people been hitting the herb. In ancient times, a medicine and mystical urge will tell the story of a trickster plant. Legal medicine, evil peddling, from Mexico to the jazz cats who sway. Louis, Ella, Cab Calloway, cannabis to reefer magnets, beat poets to flower power. Nixon, racism and the movement, reggae, Rasta, rebel music, the war on drugs on black and brown. Hip hop from the boogie down. AIDS activism, medical marijuana, California and the ganja farmer. The people's plant versus big pharma. The people's plant. This is who I honor. As I stand here, shedding a tear for every life lost, every life taken, every family broken for someone smoking on a corner. Non-violence, a moment of silence as we meditate here in the great hall in Cooper Union, in a state of communion. Exploring the story of substances. We have an endocannabinoid system in our minds. Finding time, receptors, connectors, we're moving and grooving. This is improvisation like Fay, from the written to the oral tradition. Mysticism in our vision. So it could be a taboo or expansion. It could be a cat on the corner or a cat in the mansion. But let's look for justice when we discuss this. So let us trust this. Thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you so much. I want to thank Our wonderful panelists, thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. I felt like it was incredibly insightful and fruitful. And thank you to everyone here who attended for this great event. We want to thank both New York Philharmonic and Cooper Union for hosting us and being great hosts at that. And thank you so much, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
At Baba Israel on social media.
Thank you. Yeah.